Welcome back, dreamers. Tonight, we're uncovering a side of history that's often hidden in the shadows, the strange experiments of the Great War. From battlefield medicine to psychic research, scientists and soldiers alike pushed the limits of what was possible and what was ethical. Some of these experiments were desperate attempts to save lives. Others were just desperate. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed. Hit like if you're with us for this journey, and drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Now, settle in. Dim the lights, and relax. The dawn of the First World War marked a terrifying new chapter in human conflict, where the very air above the trenches could become a weapon of unimaginable horror. Chemical warfare emerged as a brutal innovation, forever changing the nature of battle and introducing a form of violence that was both invisible and indiscriminate. It began in earnest at the Battle of Ypres in the spring of 1917, when the German army released clouds of chlorine gas against unsuspecting Allied troops. The greenish-yellow fog rolled over the battlefield like a sinister tide, seeping into trenches, choking lungs, and burning eyes. Soldiers caught in its path faced a slow and agonizing death, their bodies convulsing as their respiratory systems were ravaged by the poison. The scenes were nightmarish, unlike anything seen before, and the psychological impact was as devastating as the physical toll. This first use of chemical weapons shattered any illusions about the war being fought with traditional arms and honor. Suddenly, the battlefield became a place where men could be killed not just by bullets and shells, but by unseen clouds that crept silently across no man's land. The shock was profound, and the desperate scramble to develop defenses began almost immediately. Both sides rushed to create gas masks, crude at first, but evolving rapidly as the weapons grew deadlier. Soldiers learned to wrap cloth soaked in urine around their faces, a makeshift solution that barely held back the burning effects of chlorine. These masks soon gave way to more sophisticated devices that became lifelines, allowing men to survive in the toxic haze. Yet, even with masks, the fear of gas attacks lingered, haunting soldiers who never knew when the next invisible assault might come. The Germans did not stop with chlorine. They introduced phosgene, a gas far more lethal and slower acting, which could kill hours after exposure, making it a terrifying weapon of stealth. Mustard gas, introduced later, added another layer of cruelty. It did not kill immediately but caused horrific blisters, blindness, and respiratory damage, leaving survivors with lifelong suffering. The psychological terror of these weapons was immense. Soldiers lived with the constant dread of the next gas shell, and the trenches themselves became suffocating prisons where the threat of poison hung in the air like a dark cloud. These chemicals did not discriminate. Friend and foe alike suffered, and the wounds they inflicted were among the most gruesome and agonizing of the entire war. The justification for unleashing such horrors on the battlefield was complex and troubling. Commanders and politicians framed chemical weapons as necessary evils, tools of desperation, in a war that had stalled into stalemate and attrition. They argued that any weapon that could break the deadlock and save lives in the long run was worth deploying. But the reality was far darker. Chemical warfare shattered the boundaries of acceptable conduct. introducing suffering on a scale that blurred the line between combat and cruelty. The invisible nature of gas attacks meant that soldiers could not prepare or defend themselves fully, stripping away even the last vestiges of fairness and chivalry from battle. The ethical questions raised by this new form of killing challenged traditional ideas about war and humanity. Moreover, the use of chemical weapons reverberated far beyond the battlefield. The images of soldiers blinded, burned, and gasping for air reached the public, fueling outrage and horror. Propaganda from all sides condemned the enemy for employing such barbaric tactics, even as each side secretly developed their own arsenals of poison. The war thus entered a cycle of escalation, where each new gas was met with a countermeasure, only to be followed by another deadlier innovation. The environment of mutual suspicion and fear intensified, turning the trenches into deadly laboratories of human endurance and suffering. The Great War's chemical attacks also had lasting implications for international law and warfare. After the war, the widespread condemnation of poison gas led to treaties and agreements attempting to ban its use, though these efforts were imperfect and sometimes ignored in future conflicts. The horrors witnessed at Ypres and elsewhere left an indelible mark on collective memory, shaping the discourse around war crimes and the limits of military conduct. The images of gas masks, the haunting tales of men blinded and burned by unseen clouds, became symbols of a war that transcended traditional combat and entered into a new realm of human suffering. In considering the birth of chemical warfare, it is impossible to separate the technological innovations from the human cost. Behind every gas shell was a soldier struggling to breathe, a unit shaken by terror, and a society grappling with the consequences of turning science into a weapon of mass suffering. The war turned the very atmosphere into a battleground, and in doing so, redefined the experience of combat for all who lived through it. The legacy of these poison clouds serves as a grim reminder of how war can push humanity to its darkest extremes. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about progress, morality, and the lengths to which nations will go in pursuit of victory. The chemical weapons of the First World War were not merely tools of destruction, but symbols of a conflict that shattered old norms and opened the door to new, more insidious forms of violence. Reflecting on those first terrifying clouds at Ypres, one cannot help but wonder how humanity came to accept such horrors. Was it the desperation of a world locked in brutal conflict, the blindness of leaders consumed by ambition, or something deeper, a grim willingness to cross boundaries once thought inviolable? The answers remain elusive, but the images of choking soldiers and gas masks, etched into history, remind us that war's inventions often outpace our capacity for compassion. The sky over the trenches became a deadly veil, and beneath it, men fought not only against each other, but against the very air they needed to survive. The birth of chemical warfare changed everything, introducing an invisible enemy that haunted the minds and bodies of those who lived through the Great War. It was a new kind of terror, one that would forever change how wars were fought and how humanity grappled with the cost of conflict. During the brutal years of the First World War, the battlefield was not only a place of fierce combat, but also a grim laboratory where soldiers and prisoners became unwilling subjects for horrific medical experiments. Behind the lines, where the chaos of war gave way to the cold, clinical spaces of military hospitals and secret research stations, science took on a dark and twisted role. The desperate need to understand and counteract the new horrors of chemical warfare led armies to push the boundaries of ethics, often at the expense of human dignity and life. The human body was tested in ways previously unimaginable, turning men into guinea pigs for experiments that blurred the line between medicine and torture. The most chilling of these experiments involved the testing of chemical agents. Soldiers, sometimes volunteers but often prisoners or conscripted men, were exposed to poisonous gases to evaluate the effectiveness of protective equipment and treatments. Chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas were sprayed or released in controlled settings, leaving the subjects gasping for breath, blinded, or horribly burned. The researchers recorded the effects meticulously, seeking to improve gas masks and antidotes, but the human cost was staggering. Many of the men suffered permanent injuries, some died in agony, and all endured unimaginable pain. These experiments were justified by the claim of saving countless lives on the battlefield. But for those on the receiving end, the justification offered little comfort. Equally harrowing were the attempts to treat what was then called shell shock, a condition we now understand as post-traumatic stress disorder. Soldiers who returned from the front lines were often broken not only physically but mentally, haunted by nightmares, tremors, and paralysis, with no obvious physical cause. The military medical community was at a loss, and in their desperation, they turned to radical and experimental treatments. Electric shocks were applied to patients in an attempt to jolt them back to consciousness or cure their symptoms. Some doctors used powerful drugs, including opiates and barbiturates, while others experimented with isolation, hypnosis, and even lobotomy-like procedures. These treatments were often as brutal as the wounds they sought to heal, leaving many patients further traumatized or incapacitated. These medical horrors were not confined to one nation. Across the warring powers, similar experiments were conducted under the guise of advancing medical knowledge and improving soldier survivability. Prisoners of war were particularly vulnerable, sometimes chosen for the most extreme tests without consent. These men, already stripped of freedom, found themselves subjected to painful and degrading procedures. Their suffering was largely hidden from the public eye, buried beneath layers of military secrecy and official propaganda. Only decades later would the full extent of these wartime medical atrocities come to light. The ethical questions raised by these experiments are deeply troubling. At a time when the world was engaged in a desperate struggle for survival, the value of human life was often weighed against the potential gains in knowledge or military advantage. The line between scientific inquiry and cruel experimentation was frequently crossed, revealing the dark side of wartime innovation. It is hard to imagine the mindset that allowed doctors and researchers to rationalize such actions, but they were often seen as necessary evils, sacrifices for the greater good. This justification, however, raises painful questions about what it means to be human and how far society will go when confronted with existential threats. One particularly grim aspect of these experiments was their lasting impact on the victims. Many of the soldiers subjected to chemical testing or radical treatments were left with permanent physical and psychological scars. Blindness, respiratory diseases, chronic pain, and mental illness haunted survivors long after the guns fell silent. The lack of adequate support and rehabilitation compounded their suffering, as society struggled to care for the wounded in the aftermath of unprecedented carnage. These men bore the hidden wounds of war, invisible to most but no less real. The human laboratory of the Great War also highlights the tension between progress and morality. The rapid advances in medicine and technology during this period were often propelled by necessity and fueled by experimentation. While many innovations saved lives and improved medical care, others crossed ethical boundaries that have since become pillars of modern medical practice. The horrors witnessed during these years helped shape the principles of informed consent, humane treatment, and the protection of research subjects that govern medical ethics today. Yet the shadow of those early abuses lingers, reminding us that progress sometimes comes at a terrible price. The experiences of these medical experiments also expose the vulnerability of individuals caught in the machinery of war. Soldiers were not only fighting external enemies, but also subjected to internal battles within medical wards and laboratories. Their bodies and minds became battlegrounds where science, military ambition, and desperation collided. The line between victim and subject blurred as men were stripped of agency and reduced to objects of study. This dehumanization was one of the many tragic dimensions of the First World War, revealing how the demands of total war extended far beyond the front lines. Despite the darkness, these grim chapters also offer lessons for the future. The exposure of wartime medical abuses sparked debates about the role of ethics in science and the responsibility of governments to protect their citizens, even in times of conflict. International agreements and conventions emerged in the decades following the war, aiming to prevent such abuses from recurring. The legacy of these experiments serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of safeguarding human rights, even in the most desperate circumstances. Reflecting on the human laboratory of the Great War, we are reminded that war is not only fought with weapons and strategies, but also with ideas and experiments that can shape the fate of individuals and nations. The soldiers who endured these cruel tests symbolize the intersection of bravery and suffering, science and morality. Their stories compel us to remember the full cost of conflict and to honor those who paid with their bodies and minds for the pursuit of knowledge and victory. The war transformed not only the world, but also our understanding of human vulnerability and resilience. It exposed the limits of medical knowledge and the dangers of crossing ethical boundaries in pursuit of progress. Yet it also laid the groundwork for more humane approaches to medicine and a deeper appreciation for the dignity of every human life. The memory of those who suffered in the shadows of war challenges us to strive for a future where science serves humanity without sacrificing its soul. In the end, the human laboratory of the First World War stands as a stark reminder of the perils of desperation and the complex relationship between science and ethics. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the cost of innovation in times of conflict, and to consider the moral questions that continue to shape medical practice and warfare today. The men who became unwilling subjects in this dark chapter of history deserve to be remembered not only for their suffering, but also for the lessons their experiences teach us about the limits of human endurance and the need for compassion. In even the darkest of times, during the Great War, as the brutal reality of trench warfare settled over the battlefields, armies on all sides grew desperate, not only for physical weapons, but for ways to gain an advantage that transcended the visible. Rumors spread that some commanders sought to tap into hidden powers of the mind, hoping to create soldiers capable of telepathy, mind control, or other supernatural abilities. It might sound like the stuff of science fiction, but in the desperate fog of war, such ideas were not dismissed outright. Experiments in hypnosis, extrasensory perception, and psychic training began to appear within the military ranks, reflecting a strange mixture of hope, fear, and superstition. The origins of these experiments were rooted in a desire to push beyond the conventional limits of human capability. Commanders hoped to find soldiers who could communicate silently over distances, anticipate enemy movements without reconnaissance, or manipulate the minds of foes to sow confusion and despair. This pursuit was fueled in part by reports of mysterious phenomena on the front lines, unexplained behaviors, eerie premonitions, and strange mental states among the troops. These stories blurred the line between myth and reality, and some military leaders became convinced that harnessing such powers could change the course of the war. Hypnosis became one of the earliest methods explored. Military doctors and psychologists began using hypnotic techniques to probe the minds of soldiers suffering from shell shock, hoping to unlock repressed memories or enhance mental resilience. Some reports claimed that hypnosis could improve focus and reduce pain, potentially creating more effective and enduring fighters. However, the results were inconsistent, and many viewed these practices with skepticism. Yet, even as some dismissed hypnosis as a mere curiosity, secret programs delved deeper, trying to train soldiers to induce trance-like states or to detect hidden messages sent through mental waves. Extrasensory perception, or ESP, also captured the imagination of military planners. Experiments were conducted to determine whether individuals could sense enemy positions or intentions without traditional reconnaissance. Soldiers were tested for telepathic abilities or clairvoyance, often under controlled and highly secretive conditions. These experiments ranged from the bizarre to the disturbing, involving sensory deprivation tanks, isolated environments, and attempts to transmit mental commands over distances. While mainstream science remained doubtful, the military saw potential in any advantage, no matter how unproven or fringe. Some of these programs were shrouded in secrecy, with details buried in classified files or whispered among small circles of officials. The idea that governments were investing resources into psychic warfare seems strange today, but at the time, it was part of a broader pattern of experimentation driven by desperation. The trenches were not only battlefields, but testing grounds for any method that might break the deadlock or give an edge in a war that had become a gruesome stalemate. One of the most intriguing aspects of these psychic experiments was the belief that mind powers could be used not only defensively, but offensively. Stories circulated of attempts to develop techniques that would allow soldiers to plant suggestions in enemy minds, induce panic, or disrupt command and control through psychic influence. Whether these were based on genuine experiments or exaggerated rumors, the fact that such ideas were seriously entertained speaks volumes about the psychological state of the war and the lengths to which armies would go to tip the scales. The search for psychic abilities was not confined to any one nation. From Europe to Asia, different armies reportedly explored these strange territories of the mind. In some cases, secret societies or mystical orders within the military promoted these ideas, blending ancient spiritual practices with modern wartime needs. The line between science and magic blurred, reflecting a human desire to find hope in the unseen when all else seemed lost. The psychological toll on soldiers involved in or subjected to these experiments was profound. Many of the men tested experienced confusion, anxiety, and distress as they underwent sessions of hypnosis or isolation designed to enhance their mental faculties. The boundary between experimentation and coercion was often crossed, with soldiers pressured to perform or demonstrate abilities that may have been beyond human capacity. The impact on their mental health was compounded by the already overwhelming stresses of war, leading to long-term trauma in some cases. Critics at the time and since have questioned the legitimacy and ethics of these programs. Many viewed the pursuit of psychic soldiers as a desperate fantasy, an attempt to escape the brutal reality of trench warfare through mysticism and wishful thinking. Others suggest that these experiments reveal something darker, an obsession with control and power that ignored the humanity of those involved. The idea that the mind itself could become a battlefield opened new frontiers of conflict, but also new risks of dehumanization. Despite the lack of clear evidence that psychic powers played any decisive role in the war, the legacy of these experiments lingered. They influenced later military and intelligence efforts in the 20th century, inspiring programs that sought to harness mind control, remote viewing, and other paranormal abilities during the Cold War and beyond. The Great War's psychic experiments became an early chapter in a long and often controversial history of military interest in the powers of the human mind. These efforts also highlight the human tendency to search for meaning and advantage in times of crisis. When faced with overwhelming odds and the horrors of mechanized slaughter, armies turned to both technology and the supernatural, hoping to find a way out of the nightmare. The psychic soldier was a symbol of hope, a figure who could transcend the limits of flesh and blood and unlock hidden potentials. Whether this hope was misplaced or naive, it speaks to the profound desperation and creativity sparked by the unprecedented challenges of the Great War. Looking back, the hunt for mind powers during World War I seems both eerie and oddly fitting. It captures a moment when science, war, and mysticism collided, revealing the complexity of human responses to conflict. It reminds us that war is not only fought with guns and bombs, but also with ideas and beliefs, with hopes and fears that shape the actions of nations and individuals alike. The story of psychic soldiers invites us to consider how far humanity might go in pursuit of power and survival, and at what cost. It raises questions about the limits of science and the ethics of experimentation, especially when human lives are at stake. The shadowy world of psychic warfare in the trenches is a stark reminder that war often opens doors to strange and unsettling realms, realms where the boundaries between reality and fantasy become dangerously thin. In the end, whether viewed as desperate fantasy or a glimpse of something darker, the experiments with psychic powers during the Great War reveal much about the human condition under stress. They show a world grappling with unimaginable destruction and seeking any edge, even in the unseen depths of the mind. These stories endure not only as historical curiosities, but as echoes of a time when hope, fear, and the unknown intertwined in the most profound ways. So, when we think about the Great War and the countless lives it claimed, it is worth remembering that the conflict was fought not only on muddy fields and barbed wire, but also in the hidden chambers of the mind. The quest for psychic soldiers stands as a testament to the strange, sometimes surreal nature of war, a reminder that in moments of extreme crisis, humanity reaches out toward the mysterious, searching for salvation in places both expected and strange. The First World War brought with it many new challenges, not just on the battlefield, but in the skies above. The rapid development of aviation opened an entirely new front in warfare, and with it came medical problems that no one had fully prepared for. Flying at high altitudes exposed pilots to dangers that went far beyond enemy fire. Extreme cold, lack of oxygen, and the sheer physical strain of controlling early aircraft pushed doctors and scientists into uncharted territory as they struggled to keep these new warriors alive and capable. This was the birth of aviation medicine, a field born from necessity, filled with experimentation, some of it groundbreaking, much of it fraught with risk and sometimes tragic outcomes. Pilots in the early days of flight faced harsh conditions that were simply unimaginable to those fighting on the ground. The open cockpits of World War I aircraft offered no protection against freezing temperatures that could drop well below zero as planes soared thousands of feet above the earth. At such altitudes, the air was thin and oxygen levels dangerously low, causing symptoms that ranged from dizziness and confusion to loss of consciousness. Many pilots suffered from hypoxia, a condition caused by insufficient oxygen reaching the brain, which could easily lead to fatal mistakes during combat or long reconnaissance missions. Doctors and engineers raced to find solutions to these problems. But the science was still in its infancy, and many experiments were risky or deadly. One of the earliest attempts to address these dangers involved the development of oxygen masks designed to supply pilots with breathable air at high altitudes. These devices were crude at first, often uncomfortable and unreliable. Some pilots found their masks fogging up, others experienced leaks that rendered the equipment useless. Despite these flaws, oxygen masks became a vital piece of gear, saving countless lives and extending the operational ceiling of aircraft. The challenges of designing effective masks pushed the boundaries of engineering and physiology, combining knowledge of the human body with emerging technologies in a race against time. In addition to oxygen deprivation, pilots faced the threat of rapid decompression, a sudden drop in air pressure that could cause devastating injuries. Medical researchers studied the effects of rapid altitude changes on the body, trying to understand why some pilots experienced joint pain, paralysis, or worse. This research laid the groundwork for what would later be called the bends, a dangerous condition caused by nitrogen bubbles forming in the bloodstream when pressure drops too quickly. Early tests on volunteers involved exposing them to rapid changes in pressure, often with painful and frightening results. These experiments were dangerous, and the subjects sometimes paid a high price for the knowledge gained. Cold exposure was another relentless enemy. Pilots often flew with minimal protection against freezing winds, leading to frostbite and hypothermia. Gloves, boots, and flight suits were developed and improved over the course of the war, but many pilots still suffered from numbness, loss of dexterity, and the physical toll of battling the elements while engaged in aerial combat. Medical personnel worked to understand how to prevent and treat cold injuries, pushing advances in protective clothing and warming techniques. The harsh conditions of early flight demanded resilience and innovation in equal measure. The pressures of flight also tested pilots psychologically. The stress of dogfights, long patrols, and the constant threat of death created a unique mental burden. Aviation medicine began to recognize the importance of mental health alongside physical health, though understanding of psychological strain was limited at the time. Fatigue, anxiety, and combat stress were common, and the demands of flying required both physical endurance and mental sharpness. Medical officers sought ways to select and train pilots who could withstand these pressures, sometimes using early psychological tests and screening methods. These efforts marked a shift in military medicine toward a more holistic view of soldier health. Experimental treatments and devices were often tested directly on pilots, sometimes with mixed results. Innovations like pressurized cabins, designed to simulate lower altitudes and protect against hypoxia and decompression, were in their infancy. Early versions were bulky, heavy, and prone to failure. Pilots who flew in these experimental planes sometimes faced new dangers when the equipment malfunctioned, adding to the already high risks of aerial combat. The trial and error nature of these advancements meant that some inventions saved lives, while others inadvertently caused harm. The intersection of aviation and medicine during World War I was a crucible for learning, where the desperation of war accelerated discoveries but also highlighted the limits of knowledge. The field grew rapidly, driven by necessity and fueled by the sacrifices of those who faced the unknown dangers of early flight. These medical breakthroughs did not come without cost, but they laid the foundation for modern aerospace medicine, influencing how militaries and civilian organizations care for those who fly. Reflecting on these developments, it is clear that the challenges of early aviation pushed humanity into new realms of scientific understanding. The efforts to protect pilots from the cold, the thin air, and the mental toll of combat were pioneering steps in the ongoing quest to conquer the skies. They also revealed the fragility of the human body and mind when exposed to extreme conditions, underscoring the courage of those who took to the air despite the dangers. The story of aviation medicine during the Great War is one of innovation born from crisis. It shows how the pressures of a new kind of warfare demanded new ways of thinking about health, safety, and human limits. The doctors and engineers who worked behind the scenes faced a steep learning curve, often with lives hanging in the balance. Their successes and failures contributed to a legacy that extends far beyond the battlefields of the 1900s. In the end, the birth of aviation medicine reminds us that war is not only fought with weapons and strategy, but also with knowledge and science. It is a tale of human resilience, ingenuity, and the relentless pursuit of survival in the face of unprecedented challenges. The early pilots who braved freezing skies and oxygen-starved altitudes did so at great personal risk, relying on the fledgling science of their time. Their struggles and the medical advances that followed helped open the skies to future generations, forever changing the course of history. In the grim reality of the First World War, it was not just bullets and shells that took lives. Disease and infection became silent killers, spreading faster and more mercilessly than any weapon. The trenches, filled with mud, water, and filth, created perfect breeding grounds for illness. Soldiers suffered from a host of ailments that often proved deadlier than enemy fire. Gangrene, trench foot, typhus, dysentery, and the devastating influenza pandemic known as the Spanish flu tore through the ranks, overwhelming medical facilities and leaving armies struggling to cope. The limits of contemporary medicine were painfully exposed, revealing a war where survival depended as much on avoiding sickness as on dodging bullets. Trench foot was one of the most common afflictions soldiers faced. The constant damp and cold of the trenches meant that feet were often soaked for days on end. This led to swelling, numbness, and skin damage, creating open wounds that quickly became infected. If untreated, trench foot could result in gangrene, forcing amputations and making soldiers unable to fight. Commanders tried to educate troops on foot care, urging them to change socks and keep feet dry, but the conditions made this nearly impossible. The disease left many men disabled or dead, a reminder that the environment itself was as much an enemy as the opposing forces. Gangrene was a terrifying consequence of infections that took hold in wounds, especially those caused by the constant barrage of artillery and shrapnel. In the filthy, oxygen-poor conditions of the trenches, bacteria thrived, causing tissues to die and rot. The smell was unbearable, and the sight horrifying. Doctors resorted to amputations as the only way to save lives, but even then, many succumbed to sepsis or shock. The battle against gangrene pushed surgeons to develop new techniques for wound cleaning and the use of antiseptics, but progress was slow, and many soldiers suffered terribly. The gruesome reality of gangrene underscored the brutal nature of warfare beyond the battlefield. Infections were not limited to wounds. The cramped, unsanitary conditions of the trenches led to outbreaks of diseases like typhus and dysentery. Typhus, spread by lice, caused high fevers, delirium, and often death. Dysentery, caused by contaminated food or water, led to severe diarrhea and dehydration. Both diseases spread rapidly among troops who had limited access to clean water, proper hygiene, or medical care. entire units could be incapacitated, weakening military effectiveness. The spread of disease was a constant worry for commanders, who struggled to keep their soldiers healthy while facing the relentless grind of trench warfare. Perhaps the most devastating disease to strike during the war was the Spanish flu, which emerged in the final year and spread worldwide with staggering speed. This influenza pandemic infected millions of people, including soldiers on both sides of the conflict. Unlike typical flu strains, the Spanish flu struck young, healthy adults with deadly force, causing severe pneumonia and death within days. The close quarters of the trenches and military camps made conditions ripe for transmission. Medical services were overwhelmed, and the flu claimed more lives than many battles. The pandemic's impact extended beyond the war, shaping public health responses and revealing the vulnerability of even the most powerful nations. Medical science during the war faced tremendous challenges in combating infection and disease. The germ theory of disease was well established by this time, but the practical application of antiseptics and hygiene was often lacking in the chaos of battle. Early on, wounds were frequently treated without proper cleaning, leading to infections that might have been preventable. Over time, field hospitals improved their methods, introducing sterilization techniques and better surgical practices. The use of carbolic acid and iodine helped reduce infection rates, but medical personnel often worked in primitive and dangerous conditions, risking their own health to save others. Surgery during the war was a grim necessity, performed under difficult and sometimes unsanitary conditions. The introduction of triage systems helped prioritize the wounded, but the sheer number of casualties overwhelmed facilities. Many surgeons had to operate quickly, often with limited anesthesia or sterilization. Blood transfusions became more common, though the science behind them was still developing. The invention of mobile surgical units brought care closer to the front lines, improving survival rates but also exposing medical staff to danger. These efforts laid the groundwork for modern battlefield medicine, even as they highlighted the limitations faced at the time. Antiseptics and early antibiotics played a crucial role in saving lives, but their availability was limited. Penicillin, which would revolutionize infection treatment, was not yet discovered, and many infections remained deadly. Surgeons relied on cleaning wounds thoroughly and amputating where necessary to prevent the spread of gangrene. The fear of infection was so great that some soldiers preferred the certainty of death over the slow agony of septic wounds. This grim choice reflected the harsh reality faced by millions who suffered injury and disease on the front. The war also saw the rise of ambulance and evacuation systems designed to get the wounded to care quickly. The introduction of motorized ambulances and stretcher bearers helped improve the chances of survival, but the journey from front lines to hospitals was often long and perilous. Shell fire, mud, and poor weather conditions delayed transport, worsening injuries and increasing deaths. Medical units worked tirelessly to stabilize patients, but the numbers of casualties sometimes overwhelmed even the best-equipped facilities. The psychological impact of disease and injury was profound. Soldiers who survived infections or amputations often faced long recoveries in hospitals far from the front. The trauma of war was compounded by feelings of isolation, disability, and uncertainty about the future. Medical professionals began to recognize the importance of mental as well as physical healing, though treatments for psychological wounds were rudimentary. The experiences of those who suffered from illness and injury during the war highlighted the need for comprehensive care that addressed the whole person. Reflecting on the role of disease and infection in the First World War, it becomes clear that medical science was both a battlefield and a lifeline. The war accelerated advances in surgery, antiseptics, and evacuation techniques, but also exposed the limits of contemporary knowledge and the brutal conditions soldiers endured. Disease often dictated the outcome of battles as much as strategy and firepower, reminding us that survival depended on more than just courage. The legacy of these medical challenges shaped not only the immediate post-war period, but the future of military and civilian medicine. The lessons learned in managing infections, improving hygiene, and developing surgical techniques informed responses to later conflicts and public health crises. The war also spurred the development of vaccines, better sanitation, and an understanding of how to prevent disease spread in crowded conditions. Ultimately, the silent killers of the Great War remind us that the cost of conflict extends far beyond the battlefield. Soldiers faced enemies both visible and invisible, and the struggle to survive infection was as fierce as any fight with opposing troops. The medical professionals who battled disease under the harshest conditions deserve recognition for their courage and innovation, even as we remember the countless lives lost to illness and infection. In looking back, it is sobering to consider how disease shaped the course of the war and the lives of those who fought it. The horrors of gangrene, trench foot, typhus, and the Spanish flu are chapters of suffering that often go unnoticed amid stories of battles and heroism. Yet they remind us of the fragility of life and the relentless dangers of war. The medical history of the First World War stands as a testament to human endurance, scientific progress, and the urgent need for compassion in the face of overwhelming adversity. The First World War was not just a conflict of guns and trenches. It was also a war of unseen enemies and invisible terrors. Among the most feared weapons were chemical gases that introduced a new kind of psychological torment. Beyond the physical injuries and deaths caused by these poisons, the mental anguish inflicted on soldiers was profound and lasting. The chemical fog of war created an atmosphere of paranoia and dread that seeped into every moment spent in the trenches, changing not just the way soldiers fought, but how they lived and remembered their experiences long after the guns fell silent. From the very first use of chlorine gas at Ypres, soldiers knew that this was not a fight they could see or hear in the same way as artillery fire. The sudden hiss of gas escaping from canisters, the sickly green-yellow clouds creeping over no man's land, created an eerie and suffocating threat. Unlike bullets or shells that left visible scars, the poison gas was invisible in its intent but devastating in its effect. It attacked the lungs, causing intense coughing, choking, and the slow, painful destruction of tissue. But beyond the physical suffering was the mental terror, the knowledge that death or permanent injury could come silently through the air you breathed. The anticipation of gas attacks induced a constant state of fear. Soldiers never knew when the deadly clouds might descend. Every wind shift, every strange smell, sent men scrambling to put on their gas masks. The masks themselves were a source of anxiety. They were uncomfortable, difficult to breathe through, and sometimes unreliable. Soldiers had to be ready to don them instantly, often in the dark, amidst chaos and confusion. Failure to react quickly meant death or permanent disability. This constant readiness created a psychological strain unlike any other. It was not just the enemy across the trenches that soldiers feared, but the very air around them. The mental impact of gas warfare extended far beyond the battlefield. Survivors of gas attacks often suffered from long-term health issues that affected their breathing, energy, and overall well-being. Many were haunted by nightmares and anxiety, reliving the terror of being trapped in a cloud of poison. The psychological wounds of chemical warfare were invisible but no less real. The gas became a symbol of a new kind of war, one where the boundaries between combat and horror blurred, where the mind was as much a battleground as the land itself. Paranoia gripped entire units. The fear that gas could strike at any time led to hypervigilance. Soldiers lived in a state of heightened alert, jumping at every sudden noise or strange smell. This constant tension wore down nerves and morale. The threat of gas attacks was so pervasive that even the absence of gas could cause doubt and dread. Was it really safe, or just a brief pause before the next attack? This uncertainty created a psychological battlefield where trust in the environment, comrades, and even one's own senses was undermined. Chemical weapons also deepened divisions between soldiers and commanders. Many front-line troops viewed the use of gas as a form of cruel, indiscriminate warfare that violated unwritten rules of honor. Commanders, meanwhile, saw gas as a tactical weapon to break stalemates and gain advantage. This clash of perspectives added to the tension within armies, as soldiers bore the physical and psychological brunt of gas attacks while questioning the morality of its use. The debates over chemical warfare's ethics foreshadowed the long struggles over weapons of mass destruction in later conflicts. The psychological torment of gas extended to those who survived attacks but were left with lasting disabilities. Soldiers who had been blinded or severely scarred by gas were often shunned or pitied. The stigma of chemical injury added another layer of suffering, as survivors grappled not only with physical pain but with feelings of alienation and trauma. Many veterans carried these burdens for the rest of their lives, their memories marked by the silent, invisible enemy that had shattered their bodies and minds. Beyond individual experiences, the fear of gas attacks influenced the tactics and movements of entire armies. Soldiers avoided certain areas, retreated at signs of gas, or hesitated to advance, knowing that the very air could turn deadly. This fear sometimes disrupted operations and altered the flow of battle. The mental weight of chemical warfare changed the psychology of combat itself, introducing an element of terror that went beyond traditional weaponry. Psychological research during and after the war began to recognize the profound impact of gas on mental health. Cases of what we now understand as post-traumatic stress disorder were observed, with gas survivors exhibiting symptoms of anxiety, depression, and flashbacks. The invisible scars of chemical warfare helped to broaden the understanding of war trauma, shifting attention toward the psychological consequences of combat. This recognition was an early step in developing mental health care for veterans, though support was often limited or inadequate. The psychological impact was not limited to soldiers. Civilians near the front lines lived under the constant threat of gas attacks, adding to the terror and instability of wartime life. The fear of gas permeated entire communities, with warnings, drills, and protective measures becoming part of daily existence. This shared anxiety helped shape the cultural memory of the war, embedding chemical weapons deeply in the collective consciousness as symbols of modern horror. Despite the widespread horror, chemical weapons continued to be used throughout the war and beyond. Their psychological effects contributed to the development of international treaties banning their use in future conflicts. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 sought to outlaw chemical and biological weapons, reflecting a global acknowledgement of their uniquely cruel impact on both body and mind. The legacy of the Great War's chemical terror influenced not only military policy, but also public attitudes toward warfare and humanity. Looking back, it is clear that chemical weapons introduced a new kind of psychological warfare that went beyond traditional combat. The terror of invisible killers created a mental battlefield where fear and uncertainty were as dangerous as any gunfire. Soldiers' experiences with gas attacks revealed the profound human cost of war's technological innovations, highlighting the vulnerability of the mind and spirit under extreme stress. The story of chemical warfare's psychological impact reminds us that wars are fought not only with weapons, but with fear itself. It challenges us to consider the lasting effects of trauma and the need for compassion in healing those who survive such horrors. The invisible scars left by poison gas serve as a warning of the depths to which human cruelty can descend when the pursuit of victory eclipses respect for life. In the end, the chemical fog of war was a dark shadow cast over the Great War, one that haunts the memories of those who lived through it and shapes the way we think about conflict today. It is a testament to the resilience of the human mind that so many survived this ordeal, even as it underscores the urgent need to prevent such suffering in the future. The psychological legacy of poison gas remains a powerful reminder of the complex and often hidden costs of war. The First World War was not only a battlefield of bullets and gas, it was also a war fought in shadows, where information became a weapon as powerful as any gun. The silent war of code-breaking and secret signals emerged as a crucial front, where intelligence officers and cryptographers battled to uncover enemy plans and protect their own. This early era of intelligence work laid the foundation for modern espionage and highlighted how the flow of information could shape the fate of entire armies. Behind the roar of artillery, a quieter, cerebral fight took place in rooms filled with ciphers, codes, and intercepted messages, where the stakes were just as high and the tension just as real. From the start, both sides recognized that understanding the enemy's movements and intentions could turn the tide of battle. Secure communication was vital, and armies developed increasingly complex systems to transmit messages. Wireless telegraphy, a relatively new technology, allowed commanders to send orders quickly across distances, but it also introduced vulnerabilities. Enemy forces could intercept these transmissions if they could crack the codes, turning a valuable tool into a potential threat. This sparked a race to develop secure encryption methods and to break those of the opponent, launching one of the earliest and most intense code-breaking efforts in history. One of the most famous examples of code-breaking during the war was the work of the British Naval Intelligence Unit known as Room 40. This group was responsible for intercepting and decoding German naval communications. Their efforts played a vital role in tracking German U-boats and protecting Allied shipping routes. Room 40's success was not just a matter of technology, but also human ingenuity and persistence. Cryptanalysts pored over intercepted messages, looking for patterns, weaknesses in encryption, and clues that would reveal the hidden meanings behind the seemingly random strings of letters and numbers. The work was painstaking, often requiring long hours and intense concentration under great pressure. Breaking enemy codes was a game of patience and creativity. The German Navy used complex ciphers that changed regularly, meaning that once a code was cracked, the enemy would soon switch to a new system. Cryptographers had to constantly adapt, developing new methods and tools to keep pace. This back-and-forth struggle resembled a deadly chess match, where every piece of information gained could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Success in code breaking allowed commanders to anticipate attacks, avoid traps, and plan countermeasures with an advantage that the enemy did not suspect. In addition to radio transmissions, armies used coded messages sent by runners, couriers, and signal flags. These methods were slower, but sometimes more secure, especially when wireless transmissions were vulnerable to interception. However, no system was foolproof, and spies and double agents frequently tried to intercept or alter messages to sow confusion. The presence of spies added another layer of complexity to the intelligence war, as trust became scarce and paranoia grew. Commanders had to balance the need for communication with the risk of betrayal, making every message a potential liability. The development of cryptography during the war extended beyond military messages. Governments used secret codes to protect diplomatic communications and to coordinate complex operations behind enemy lines. Codes became more sophisticated, incorporating elements like substitution ciphers, transposition methods, and polyalphabetic systems. The art and science of encryption advanced rapidly, driven by necessity and the urgency of war. These innovations paved the way for future developments in secure communication that would shape the coming decades. One of the remarkable aspects of this intelligence struggle was the human element. Behind every broken code was a team of analysts, linguists, mathematicians, and linguists who applied their skills to unravel secrets. Some worked in relative obscurity, their contributions unknown to the public for decades. Their work required not only intellectual prowess, but also creativity and intuition. They had to guess at the intentions of the enemy, recognize patterns that might seem like random noise, and collaborate under intense pressure. Their success demonstrated how warfare was as much a battle of minds as of weapons. The race to intercept and decode messages also fueled technological innovation. Advances in radio technology, signal processing, and cryptographic devices were accelerated by the demands of the war. Early attempts at mechanical encryption devices began during this period, hinting at the future development of machines like the Enigma. Although these devices were rudimentary compared to what came later, they represented a step towards automating the complex and error-prone task of encoding messages. The intertwining of technology and intelligence work during the war marked a turning point in how information would be handled in conflicts. This silent war of signals and codes was not without its failures. Misinterpretations, missed clues, and intercepted messages that went unnoticed sometimes led to devastating consequences. Intelligence is inherently uncertain, and commanders had to make decisions with incomplete or ambiguous information. The fog of war extended into the realm of information, where even the best intelligence could be flawed or manipulated. False leads and disinformation campaigns added to the confusion, making it difficult to distinguish truth from deception. This uncertainty was a constant challenge for those involved in intelligence work. Beyond the immediate tactical advantages, the intelligence efforts of the First World War had broader implications for the conduct of warfare. They demonstrated the increasing importance of information superiority and the need for organized intelligence agencies within governments. The war highlighted that victory depended not only on firepower and manpower, but also on knowledge and secrecy. These lessons would resonate in future conflicts, leading to the establishment of permanent intelligence services and the integration of information warfare into military strategy. The psychological impact of the intelligence war was also significant. Knowing that the enemy could intercept messages or that secret plans might be uncovered added to the stress and paranoia experienced by soldiers and commanders alike. Trust became a precious commodity, and fears of betrayal or espionage were constant companions. This environment of suspicion affected morale and decision-making, showing that intelligence shaped not only the physical battlefield, but also the minds of those who fought. In reflecting on the birth of code-breaking and secret signals during the First World War, it becomes clear that this was a war of many layers. Beneath the chaos of trenches and the roar of artillery lay a quieter, invisible conflict that shaped outcomes in profound ways. The dedication and skill of those who worked in intelligence were crucial to the war effort, even if their contributions remained hidden for many years. Their story is one of ingenuity, persistence, and the relentless quest to turn secrets into survival. The legacy of this intelligence struggle extends far beyond the Great War. It set the stage for modern espionage and cryptography, influencing how nations conduct intelligence and protect information to this day. The technologies and methods developed during this time evolved into the sophisticated cyber and signals intelligence operations of the modern era. Understanding this history helps us appreciate the complex and often unseen battles that continue to shape global conflicts. In the end, the silent war of codebreakers and signal interceptors reminds us that information is a powerful weapon. In the world of war, knowledge can save lives, change strategies, and alter the course of history. The men and women who fought this invisible battle deserve recognition for their crucial role in a conflict that reshaped the world. Their story is a testament to the enduring importance of intelligence in the pursuit of peace and security. During the First World War, the idea of creating super soldiers captured the imaginations of military leaders desperate for an edge in the brutal and grinding conflict. As the war dragged on, armies sought new ways to enhance the abilities of their troops, making them faster, stronger, and more resilient. This led to a series of early experiments with stimulants and drugs, which promised to push soldiers beyond their natural limits. These attempts, while often reckless and ethically dubious, highlighted the desperation of nations locked in total war and raised questions about the true cost of human enhancement. One of the most widely used substances was cocaine, a drug known for its stimulating effects. Cocaine was often distributed in small doses to soldiers to help them stay awake during long watches and to reduce feelings of fatigue. In the chaos of trench warfare, where exhaustion was constant and opportunities for rest were rare, such stimulants seemed like a valuable tool. Soldiers reported increased alertness and energy, but the drug's addictive potential and harmful side effects soon became apparent. Over time, the initial benefits were overshadowed by jitteriness, paranoia, and crashes that left users vulnerable. Amphetamines emerged as another key stimulant used during the war. These drugs, which affect the central nervous system, were administered to troops to boost endurance and reduce hunger and fatigue. Amphetamines were seen as a way to keep soldiers functioning at high levels despite the physical and mental strain of battle. However, the widespread use of these substances raised concerns about long-term health effects and the ethical implications of chemically enhancing soldiers. The line between medical treatment and experimentation became blurred as armies sought to optimize human performance by any means necessary. The use of stimulants was not limited to boosting energy. Some experiments aimed to improve soldiers' focus, reduce fear, and increase aggression. These qualities were seen as advantageous in the brutal combat conditions of the trenches, where hesitation could mean death. Drugs that altered mood and perception were tested, sometimes on willing soldiers and other times on prisoners or unsuspecting subjects. The ethics of such experimentation were questionable, with few safeguards in place to protect those involved. Many soldiers suffered from addiction, mental health issues, and physical problems as a result of these early drug trials. Beyond stimulants, the war saw attempts to use other substances for medical or experimental purposes. Morphine, a powerful painkiller, was widely used to manage battlefield injuries, but its addictive nature also led to cases of dependency among wounded soldiers. Experimental drugs intended to treat conditions like shell shock, a term then used to describe what we now understand as post-traumatic stress disorder, were tested with mixed results. Treatments included sedatives, hypnosis, and electrical stimulation, reflecting a limited understanding of mental health at the time. These efforts showed the desperation to find solutions, but also highlighted the dangers of untested methods. The pursuit of enhanced soldiers extended into attempts to improve physical performance through other means. Nutrition became a focus, with militaries experimenting with different rations and supplements to maintain strength and stamina. Some armies provided their troops with caffeine or other stimulants in their food and drink. While these efforts were grounded in practical concerns, they also reflected a growing belief that the human body could be pushed further with the right substances. The notion of the soldier as a machine to be optimized was beginning to take hold. These experiments took place in an environment where ethical considerations were often secondary to military necessity. The chaos and urgency of war created conditions where testing drugs on soldiers or prisoners seemed justified in the name of victory. Consent was rarely obtained, and the long-term effects on individuals were not fully considered. Many participants in these experiments suffered lasting consequences, including addiction, physical harm, and psychological trauma. The human cost of these early attempts at enhancement is a somber reminder of the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition in times of conflict. The use of drugs also had social and cultural impacts on soldiers and the societies they came from. Some troops became reliant on stimulants to cope with the demands of warfare, while others viewed these substances with suspicion or fear. The stigma surrounding drug use complicated efforts to address addiction and mental health problems among veterans after the war. Families and communities struggled to understand the changes in returning soldiers, many of whom faced physical and psychological challenges linked to their wartime experiences with drugs and medical experimentation. Despite the dangers and ethical issues, the experiments conducted during the First World War laid important groundwork for future research in military medicine and pharmacology. Scientists and doctors gained insights into the effects of various substances on human performance and health. These lessons informed later developments in the use of stimulants and painkillers in military contexts, as well as broader medical applications. The war accelerated scientific inquiry, but it also underscored the need for ethical standards and protections for human subjects. Looking back, the search for super soldiers during the Great War reflects the intense pressures faced by military leaders and the lengths to which they were willing to go to gain advantage. The drive to enhance soldiers was born of desperation in a conflict marked by staggering casualties and grinding stalemates. It was a time when the boundaries of science, ethics, and human dignity were tested, often with tragic consequences. The story of these early experiments invites us to consider the costs of pursuing power at any price and the enduring challenges of balancing innovation with humanity. The legacy of this period continues to influence debates about military enhancement and the use of drugs in combat. Modern armed forces grapple with questions about performance-enhancing substances, the treatment of psychological trauma, and the ethical limits of scientific intervention in soldiers' lives. The experiences of the First World War serve as a cautionary tale, reminding us that while the desire to improve human capability is natural, it must be tempered by respect for the individuals involved and an awareness of potential harm. Ultimately, the early experiments in soldier enhancement during the First World War reveal the complex interplay between science, warfare, and human nature. They show a moment in history when desperation and innovation collided, producing advances that changed medicine and military practice, but also inflicted suffering. As we reflect on these stories, we are challenged to learn from the past, to approach the future with caution, and to remember the human beings behind every scientific breakthrough and military strategy. The First World War was a time of innovation and desperation, and not every idea made it from the drawing board to the battlefield. Alongside the weapons and technologies that defined the war, many strange and often bizarre experimental devices were developed. Some pushed the boundaries of science, others bordered on madness, and many were simply too dangerous or impractical to be used in combat. These forgotten weapons and inventions tell a story of a conflict that spurred human creativity and horror in equal measure, revealing a world where the line between genius and madness was sometimes very thin. One of the more unusual attempts to change the nature of warfare involved the idea of flamethrowers. Early versions were clumsy and unreliable, often posing a danger to the operators themselves. The notion of spraying flames across no man's land was terrifying in theory, but the practicalities were challenging. Fuel tanks were heavy and difficult to carry, and the mechanisms to project fire were prone to failure. Still, these early flamethrowers marked a turning point in combat, introducing a weapon that could flush enemy soldiers out of trenches and bunkers with searing heat. Despite their limitations, they foreshadowed the widespread use of flamethrowers in later conflicts, showing how early experiments paved the way for future military innovations. The war also saw the development of tanks, but not every tank design made it to the front. Some prototypes were massive and slow, barely able to move across the muddy battlefields. Others were experiments in mobility and armor that failed tests or were too complex to manufacture in large numbers. These early tanks were far from the sleek machines we know today. They were cumbersome, noisy, and prone to mechanical failure. Yet they represented a major leap in military technology, hinting at a future where armored vehicles would dominate land warfare. The trial and error of tank development during the Great War is a testament to the challenges of adapting new ideas to the brutal realities of combat. Beyond conventional weaponry, the First World War also witnessed attempts to weaponize animals. One of the strangest projects involved bats. The idea was to equip bats with small incendiary devices and release them over enemy cities, where they would roost in buildings and start fires. This plan, while inventive, was wildly impractical and dangerous even to those who proposed it. Controlling where the bats would go proved impossible, and the risk of the fire spreading uncontrollably made the project too risky to deploy. Though it never saw combat, this experiment illustrates the extremes to which military planners were willing to go in search of new methods to break the stalemate. Chemical sprays and other novel delivery systems were also tested during the war. The horrors of poison gas attacks led to investigations into different chemicals and dispersal methods, including devices that could spray liquid toxins or create noxious clouds more effectively. Some of these experiments involved toxic agents too dangerous to handle safely, resulting in accidents that injured or killed those involved in testing. The development of chemical weapons was a grim aspect of the war, showing how science was harnessed to inflict suffering on a massive scale. These forgotten weapons highlight the dark side of innovation during a conflict that pushed technology into terrifying new territories. One of the challenges faced by inventors was the unpredictability of new weapons on the battlefield. Many devices worked well in controlled conditions, but failed spectacularly under fire. Mechanical complexity, weight, and vulnerability to enemy fire often doomed prototypes before they could be mass-produced. Logistics and supply chains were strained by the introduction of new technology, making it difficult to provide spare parts or maintain complicated machines. This reality forced armies to be selective in adopting new inventions, often abandoning promising ideas simply because they could not be practically deployed. The psychological impact of experimental weapons should not be overlooked. The mere knowledge that strange and deadly new technologies were being developed added to the fear and uncertainty experienced by soldiers. The unpredictability of encountering unknown devices or weapons created an atmosphere of constant tension. Stories of bizarre weapons circulated among troops, sometimes exaggerated but always contributing to the sense that the war was becoming something otherworldly. This atmosphere influenced morale and perceptions of the enemy, turning warfare into a surreal experience where survival depended on adapting to both known and unknown dangers. Some experimental weapons were shrouded in secrecy, developed in hidden laboratories or remote testing grounds. The fear that these inventions might be unleashed on the enemy before they were ready created an environment of intense competition and paranoia. Military officials guarded their research closely, sometimes restricting information even from allies. This secrecy extended to failures and accidents, which were often swept under the rug to maintain morale and confidence in the war effort. The culture of secrecy surrounding experimental weapons contributed to a mystique that still captures the imagination today. While many inventions from the war faded into obscurity, a few paved the way for future developments. Concepts tested during the conflict influenced the design of tanks, flamethrowers, chemical weapons, and other military technologies used in later wars. The trial-and-error approach of the First World War highlighted the importance of adapting technology to the realities of combat and showed the need for rigorous testing and evaluation before deployment. These lessons shaped the evolution of military science, demonstrating that innovation in war is as much about refinement as it is about invention. The human cost of these experiments was significant, but often overlooked. Soldiers and technicians involved in testing sometimes faced grave risks. Handling experimental chemicals or operating unproven machines led to accidents that caused injury and death. The pressure to produce effective weapons quickly left little room for safety or ethics. The stories of those who suffered during these experiments remind us that the pursuit of military advantage can exact a heavy toll on individuals, even before weapons are used in battle. Reflecting on the forgotten weapons and experimental technologies of the First World War reveals a side of the conflict that is rarely discussed in popular history. Beyond the mud and blood of the trenches was a world of laboratories and workshops, where scientists and engineers worked feverishly to turn ideas into tools of war. Some inventions showed promise but failed due to technical challenges or impracticality. Others crossed ethical lines, pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable in the name of victory. These experiments underscore the complex relationship between innovation and destruction in times of war. In the end, the weapons and technologies that never made it to the battlefield are a testament to human creativity and human folly. They remind us that war drives rapid change, often at a pace and scale that outstrips caution and morality. The First World War's strange inventions illustrate how the desperation and urgency of total war can lead to remarkable breakthroughs, but also to reckless and dangerous experiments. These stories add depth to our understanding of the war, showing that beyond the well-known battles and strategies lay a hidden world of invention and risk. These forgotten weapons also provoke us to think about the future of warfare. As technology continues to evolve rapidly, the challenges of balancing innovation, ethics, and human cost remain. The legacy of the First World War's experimental arsenal serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us that not all progress is beneficial, and that the consequences of unchecked technological ambition can be profound. Understanding this history helps us appreciate the complexity of war and the importance of careful consideration in the development and use of new weapons. Looking back at the strange and sometimes chilling attempts to change the face of combat during the First World War, we see a war that was fought not only with guns and shells, but with ideas and experiments. Many of these inventions faded into obscurity, but their echoes remain in the continued quest for military advantage through science and technology. Their stories challenge us to remember the human costs behind every technological leap and to approach the future with both hope and caution. The First World War was a crucible that reshaped not only the face of warfare, but also the relationship between science, ethics, and humanity. The strange experiments and technological leaps born from the desperation of the trenches left a legacy that still echoes through modern military and medical practices. As the war finally drew to a close, the world faced the enormous task of reckoning with what had been unleashed, the innovations that saved lives, the horrors that destroyed them, and the ethical quandaries that would challenge generations to come. Looking back, it is clear that the Great War was a turning point. It marked the moment when the industrial scale of conflict demanded not only mass armies, but mass innovation. Scientists, doctors, engineers, and soldiers all found themselves thrust into roles they had never imagined, pushed by the urgent need to adapt to new realities. From chemical weapons to early aviation medicine, from the silent battles of code breakers to the psychological scars of poison gas, the war blurred the lines between man and machine, courage and suffering, progress and destruction. One of the most enduring lessons from these strange experiments is the reminder that technology alone does not win wars. While new weapons and medical advances altered battlefields, the human spirit, its resilience, fear, and determination remained at the heart of the conflict. Soldiers endured unimaginable horrors and uncertainty, often pushed beyond their limits by forces beyond their control. The experiments that sought to enhance, heal, or control these individuals sometimes succeeded, but just as often they exposed the vulnerabilities of both body and mind. The war laid bare the complex interplay between science and humanity, showing that progress without ethics can lead to tragedy. The aftermath of the war brought an increased awareness of the need for rules and moral boundaries in warfare. The terrifying impact of chemical weapons and the abuses in medical experimentation fueled calls for international agreements. The Geneva Protocol, adopted a few years after the war, banned the use of chemical and biological weapons, reflecting a global desire to prevent the horrors witnessed from happening again. These early steps toward regulating warfare technologies marked a shift toward recognizing the importance of ethical constraints even amid conflict. Yet, the challenge of balancing military necessity with human rights remained, and still remains, a difficult and ongoing struggle. On the medical front, the war accelerated the development of emergency care, surgery, and rehabilitation. Techniques pioneered in the battlefield hospitals informed civilian medicine for decades to come. The experience with mental trauma, although limited in understanding at the time, laid groundwork for modern psychology and psychiatry. The harsh realities of war showed that healing was not only physical but also psychological, and the lessons learned began to change how societies viewed and treated those affected by combat. The legacy of medical experimentation during the war, both its successes and failures, continues to influence the principles of patient consent and ethical research. The technological innovations that emerged from the First World War also shaped the nature of future conflicts. The introduction of tanks, chemical agents, and advanced communications changed how wars were fought, making battles more mechanized and deadly. The experiences with early aviation medicine presaged the importance of adapting human physiology to new modes of warfare. The silent war of codebreakers and intelligence experts revealed that knowledge and information had become as vital as firepower. These developments foreshadowed the complex, multifaceted nature of modern warfare, where technology and intelligence operate alongside traditional combat. Despite the progress, the war's experiments also left darker shadows. The human cost was staggering, and the ethical breaches committed in the name of science serve as warnings. The use of soldiers and prisoners as test subjects without consent, the deployment of chemical weapons that caused horrific suffering, and the reckless pursuit of enhancement all reflect moments when humanity was compromised. These stories remind us that scientific advancement must be tempered by compassion and responsibility. They challenge us to remember the individuals behind the data and inventions, the men and women whose lives were changed or ended by these experiments. The psychological impact of the war's horrors cannot be overstated. Soldiers returned home bearing invisible wounds as devastating as any physical injury. The fear of poison gas, the trauma of constant bombardment, and the strains of prolonged combat created a generation deeply scarred. Societies struggle to understand and support veterans, often falling short. The war forced a reckoning with mental health, a conversation that continues to evolve. The recognition that war wounds are not only skin deep marked a significant shift in how humanity confronts the cost of conflict. As the world moved beyond the trenches and gas clouds, the lessons of the First World War began to shape international relations and military policy. The devastation underscored the need for diplomacy, arms control, and mechanisms to prevent such catastrophic wars in the future. Yet, as history showed, the horrors of one war often sow the seeds for the next. The technologies and methods developed in the Great War would be refined, expanded, and sometimes abused in conflicts that followed. The legacy of the strange experiments and innovations remains a complex tapestry of hope, warning, and remembrance. In reflecting on the war's conclusion, we see a world forever changed by the intersection of human ingenuity and human suffering. The strange experiments of the Great War were born out of necessity and desperation, pushing boundaries that challenged notions of what was acceptable in pursuit of victory. The stories of these inventions, discoveries, and abuses compel us to confront difficult questions about the cost of progress and the responsibilities that come with power. They remind us that in the rush to innovate, the human element must never be forgotten. Today, as we face new challenges in warfare and medicine, the echoes of the First World War's strange science remind us to tread carefully. The past teaches that unchecked ambition, even in times of crisis, can lead to profound consequences. It also shows the resilience and adaptability of people faced with unimaginable odds. The balance between innovation and ethics, between survival and humanity, is delicate and essential. Remembering the lessons of the Great War helps ensure that future generations do not repeat its darkest mistakes. Ultimately, the story of the First World War's strange experiments is a story of humanity itself, its capacity for creativity, cruelty, endurance, and hope. It is a reminder that even amid the horrors of war, people sought solutions to save lives and end suffering, while also sometimes causing new pains in the pursuit of victory. As we look back, we honor those who endured, those who risked all to push the limits of knowledge, and those who suffered in silence. Their experiences shape our understanding of war, science, and the fragile nature of progress. The Great War ended over a century ago, but its strange experiments and the questions they raise remain with us. They call us to reflect on what it means to be human in times of conflict, to weigh the costs of innovation against the value of life, and to strive for a future where science serves humanity with wisdom and care. The legacy of the war's hidden battles, the silent struggles of scientists, doctors, soldiers, and survivors continues to teach us that in the darkest moments, the choices we make define not only the course of history, but the soul of humanity itself. From the very start, it was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting to see if this tiny new life was worth celebrating or quietly mourning. The first cries of the baby girl echoed in a darkened room lit only by the glow of a flickering oil lamp. She was wrapped in worn cloth and cradled by hands that hesitated. In that moment, everyone seemed to sigh and shift their eyes away as though they could not bear to meet the tiny infant's gaze. I mean, you could almost feel it in the air, the sharp sting of disappointment that this baby was a girl and not a boy. It was the ancient world, after all, where sons were prized above all else, and daughters were, well, daughters were a burden to be carried and a cost to be paid. Her mother looked down at the small face of her child, and you know what's even stranger, she did love her, but that love was mixed with fear and sadness. She knew what lay ahead for a girl born in such a time and place. The father's face was tight as he turned away, his thoughts already racing toward the future and the money he would need to save for her dowry. At first glance, it might seem totally normal, a family welcoming a new baby, but the truth was, this was no cause for celebration. Honestly, I don't know if I believe it myself, but some say the midwife even muttered a quiet curse when she saw the baby's tiny hands opening and closing in the faint light. Could be nothing, but people whispered about fate and fortune and whether a girl would bring luck or misfortune. The truth is, girls were rarely welcomed with the same open arms as boys. From the moment she drew her first breath, this little one was seen not as a gift, but as a cost. She would grow up in a home where every mouthful of food she took would be measured against her worth, where every step she took would be watched for signs that she might one day ease the family's burden through marriage or hard labor. Some people swear it's real, others think it's nonsense, who knows? But there were even families that would leave a baby girl out in the cold to die if they could not afford to keep her. I don't know how much of this is true, but the pattern is undeniable. Life for a girl in the ancient world started with a debt she never asked for. Imagine for a moment the quiet ache that must have settled into her mother's heart. The mother's arms were warm and soft, but behind that warmth was a mind already calculating how to raise a girl in a world that never wanted her. And so the baby was rocked and shushed and whispered to, even as the father looked out the window into the night, wondering what use a daughter could possibly be. Let me be real with you here. It's a hard thing to hear, but that's how it was. In this ancient world, every family hoped for a son because a son meant strength and legacy and a promise of protection in old age. A daughter meant expense, a future of worrying about finding a good husband and paying that heavy dowry. It's one of those things that just doesn't sit right when you think about it. But that was how people saw it. Girls were seen as a weight on a family's shoulders even before they could walk or talk. So, what does that mean for a girl like this one? Well, she would grow up knowing every look and every sigh was a reminder that she was not the son they had hoped for. She would hear her father's voice, low and tired, talking late at night about debts and land, and how a girl would never be enough. She would watch her mother's hands shake as she tried to stretch thin resources to feed every hungry mouth. And the girl herself would learn early that love in this world came with conditions. I'll never forget the first time I read about this, and honestly, it gave me chills. The stories of baby girls left to die or mothers weeping because they knew their daughters would never be truly safe or valued. You can decide for yourself, but here's what I found. In so many of these ancient places, a girl's birth was the first in a long line of battles she would have to fight. Battles she never asked for and might never win. Could be nothing, but think about what that does to a person's spirit. To know from the start that you were a disappointment, that your life was measured by how much it would cost to keep you alive. To know that your body was a future transaction, a bargaining chip in alliances you had no voice in. The cradle might have been soft and warm, but it was also the first cage. Anyway, back to the point. What did that baby girl see when she first opened her eyes to the world? Did she sense the way her parents flinched, or the way the neighbors gossiped? Did she feel the weight of expectations already pressing down on her tiny chest? We cannot know for sure, but I have seen enough to wonder if there's something more to it. Like an echo that never fades, a truth that still haunts us, even now. It's just odd, isn't it? How the same cradle that rocked her to sleep also taught her her worth, or rather her lack of it. And you know what's even stranger? That this pattern kept repeating itself generation after generation like a cycle no one could break. A girl born into a world that never wanted her, her only hope was to somehow prove herself in a system that was built to keep her silent. So, here we are at the start of this story. A tiny baby girl in a darkened room, her mother's arms warm but her father's eyes distant. Outside the night was silent, and inside the whispers had already begun. She was a burden, a cost, a future debt to be paid. But what does that feel like, really? What does it do to a person to know from the very start that you are something to be endured rather than celebrated? I mean, I can't prove it, obviously, but it's worth considering. When a child grows up surrounded by those unspoken truths, how does she find her own voice? How does she ever believe she is more than what they say she is? And here's the real kicker. How did it feel to grow up knowing the world never wanted you? From the very first breath of a girl in this ancient world, her life was already marked by the expectations of marriage. It was not the sweet story of a fairy tale where two people found each other and fell in love. No. Marriage was a transaction, and she was the currency. Her family was her first marketplace. I mean, you have to wonder how it felt to be so young and yet already know that your future was not yours to shape. Some people might say it was just the way of things, but let me be real with you. Here it was a way of life that turned daughters into bargaining chips and mothers into quiet witnesses of deals they had no power to stop. At first glance, it might seem totally normal, a father talking about dowries and alliances, as if he were discussing the price of grain or wool. But when you think about it, it's more than just numbers and promises. It is about a young girl's whole life being traded for another family's advantage. Could be nothing, but the way they spoke of daughters like goods to be weighed and measured tells you everything you need to know. Fathers would sit in small, dusty rooms and speak in low voices about how many cows or how much silver they might receive in exchange for their daughter's hand. They would talk about family ties and political gain and how this marriage would secure their place in the community. And in those quiet conversations, there was never any mention of what the girl might want or need. Imagine for a moment what that must have felt like for her. One day she was a child playing with scraps of cloth and singing little songs in the courtyard, and the next she was a promise to be sold to a man she might never have seen before. She would have watched her mother's eyes filled with sorrow but also resignation, because this was the way things had always been. You know what's even stranger? The girl might not even have been old enough to understand what marriage really meant, and yet she would know in her bones that her fate was no longer her own. I'll never forget the first time I read about these marriages of convenience and power. Honestly, it gave me chills. The idea that a young girl's innocence and laughter could be bought and sold like any other good in the market. The father would look at his daughter not with tenderness, but with calculation. The mother would smooth the girl's hair and whisper that it would be all right, even if she did not believe it herself. And the girl, well, she would learn early that her worth was measured in the weight of silver or the size of a field. So what kind of love could ever grow from such chains? I mean, think about it. A young girl forced to marry a man 3 or 4 times her age, a stranger who saw her not as a partner but as a prize. He might have had children already, or he might have been old enough to be her grandfather. Some people swear these marriages brought peace between families, but at what cost to the girl herself? She would have to learn to hide her fear and smile politely as she was handed over like a piece of property. And the truth is, she would have no choice. Her father's word was law, and the world expected her to obey without question. Could be nothing but the way these girls were taught to be silent still haunts me. They were taught to lower their eyes and bow their heads and accept whatever fate was decided for them. They were told that obedience was their duty and that love, if it came at all, was just a dream for storybooks. So she would stand there in a room full of men talking about land and cattle, and she would know deep down that her voice did not matter. Honestly, I don't know if I believe it myself, but some say there were girls who tried to run away, who tried to fight back, but most of them knew there was nowhere to go. A girl without a family or a husband in the ancient world was as good as dead. So they stayed, they obeyed, and in those quiet moments when no one was watching, they wept. You can decide for yourself, but here's what I found. This was not just about marriage. It was about power and control, and the idea that a girl's body and future belonged not to her, but to the men who claimed to protect her. The father, the husband, the elders of the community, they all had a say in her life. Everyone but her. It's one of those rabbit holes you just can't stop thinking about because it's so unfair and yet so real. Imagine the fear in her heart as she was led to her new home. The walls would have been strange, and the air heavy with the scent of unfamiliar spices and the weight of expectation. She would have to learn how to be a wife, how to serve her husband's family, how to keep her head down and her thoughts hidden. And if she was lucky, maybe, just maybe, she would find some small piece of kindness in that house. But more often than not, she would find only duty and the unending reminder that she was there not because she was loved, but because she was bought. So, what does that do to a person? What kind of dreams can you have when you are told from the start that your happiness does not matter? That your job is to be quiet, to be obedient, to be useful? And that if you fail, you bring shame not just on yourself, but on your whole family. It's just odd, isn't it? How something as simple as a marriage can become a prison with no bars and no keys. Anyway, back to the point. These girls grew up fast. They learned to smile even when they wanted to scream. They learned to carry their pain in silence because that was what was expected of them. And so the cycle continued. Fathers sold daughters, husbands claimed wives, and the world looked on as if it was all perfectly normal. But was it? Really? Some people swear this was the only way to survive, that these marriages were necessary for peace and stability. But I can't prove that, and I don't think I want to, because here's the real question. What kind of love could ever grow from such chains? Once the wedding was done, and the girl was handed over to her husband's family, she would find herself in a home that was no longer hers. I mean, it is one of those things you can hardly imagine unless you have lived it, the slow suffocation of being trapped in a life you did not choose. The house might have been grand, or it might have been simple, but either way, it became her prison. She would have to learn quickly how to keep her head down, how to move quietly, how to do everything exactly the way her husband's family expected. At first glance, it might seem like a normal part of life, but honestly, it was a kind of captivity that no one wanted to admit. She would wake each morning before the sun rose, feeling the cold floor under her feet as she went about the endless chores. Could be nothing, but even the smallest mistake could bring a sharp word or a harsh look. There was no room for rest, no space for dreams, only the constant pressure to be the perfect wife and daughter-in-law. Cooking, cleaning, fetching water, weaving cloth, it was all her work, and no matter how hard she tried it, was never quite enough. You know what's even stranger? The older women of the household would watch her every move, their eyes sharp, and their voices quick to find fault. It is just odd, isn't it, how a home that should have been a refuge could become a cage? She would move through the rooms like a ghost, never quite sure of her place, and never sure if she would be welcomed or scolded. Let me be real with you here. The silence was its own kind of punishment. In those long hours of work, she would barely hear her own thoughts, and the only voices were those telling her how to be better, how to be more. And all the while she would wonder if this was what her life was meant to be. Honestly, I don't know if I believe it myself, but some say that in those quiet moments she would hear her own heart whispering that there had to be more. I'll never forget the first time I read about the way women were forced to live in these homes with no freedom and no choice. It gave me chills. The idea that a young girl who once dreamed of laughter and light would find herself trapped behind walls that felt like they were closing in. The house might have been warm with the scent of cooking fires and the voices of children, but for her, it was a place of endless demands. Every day she would rise with the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders, and every night she would go to sleep wondering if tomorrow would be any different. Anyway, back to the point. Privacy was a luxury she could never afford. Even her own thoughts felt like they did not belong to her. There were no doors she could close, no corners where she could hide. Every meal, every word, every breath was under the watchful eyes of others. Some people swear that this kind of life was just how it had to be, but I can't prove that, and I don't think I want to. Because the truth is, it takes something from you to live like that. It steals your voice, your laughter, your very self. Imagine the fear she must have felt knowing that one wrong word, one careless slip, could bring shame not just on her, but on her entire family. She would learn to swallow her anger and her sorrow because there was no room for either in this world. And the thing is, she was expected to do it all with a smile, to serve without complaint, to care for her husband's family as if they were her own, even when they made her feel like a stranger. You can decide for yourself, but here's what I found. The home that should have been her safe place became the place where her spirit was tested every single day. It's one of those rabbit holes you just can't stop thinking about because it feels so unfair. How can a person keep their spirit alive when every door is locked against them? When even the smallest act of rebellion is seen as a threat to the order of things, and yet somehow she found a way to keep going. Maybe it was in the way she sang softly to herself as she worked, or the way she found small moments of peace in the quiet hours of the night. Maybe it was in the secret dreams she held close to her heart, dreams she would never speak out loud. So, what does that do to a person to live like that year after year? To be told that her worth was measured by how well she served, how quietly she obeyed, how perfectly she fit into a mold she never chose. Could be nothing, but I think it leaves a scar that never really heals. It is like a chain wrapped around your heart, reminding you every day that you belong to someone else. And you know what's even stranger? There were moments when she almost believed it herself, when the endless chores and the constant voices telling her what to do became the only world she knew. It is just odd how a person can forget the sound of their own laughter when they are told over and over again that their place is to serve and nothing more. Let me be real with you here. There is something deeply wrong with that. To live in a home that should have been filled with warmth and safety, and instead find only walls and rules. To be told that your happiness does not matter, that your dreams are too dangerous to be spoken out loud. Some people swear this was the only way to keep families strong, but I have seen enough to wonder if that was ever really true. So, here is the question that haunts me. How do you keep your spirit alive when every door is locked against you? How do you hold on to the hope that there is more to life than this narrow world you were born into? Honestly, I don't know if I have the answer, but I think it is a question worth asking. And then, nothing. The world keeps turning, and the girl keeps moving through her days doing what she must to survive. But in the quiet moments, when no one is watching, maybe, just maybe, she dares to dream of something more, of a life where her laughter is not a threat, where her voice is not a burden, a life where the walls of her home do not feel like a prison. Anyway, back to the point. In this ancient world, a woman's home was her prison, her voice was her silence, and her dreams were the one thing she could never speak. And yet, even in that darkness, there was always a flicker of something more, a quiet rebellion in the way she kept going, in the way she found small moments of peace in a world that wanted her to disappear. It is one of those things that just does not sit right, and it never will. In this ancient world where honor was everything, a woman's body was often the battleground for that honor. It is one of those truths that is hard to look at directly, but it was everywhere in the stories and the whispers and the unspoken rules that everyone seemed to know by heart. From the moment she could walk, she was taught that her worth was tied to the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she kept her eyes down and her mouth shut. Could be nothing but the weight of that lesson shaped every part of her life. Imagine growing up with the constant knowledge that one mistake, real or imagined, could cost you everything. Some people swear that this was the only way to keep families strong, but let me be real with you. Here it was a burden that no one should have had to carry. Fathers and brothers and husbands, they all held the power to decide if a woman was pure enough to be protected or if she had failed in her duty. And if she failed, well, the price was paid in blood. At first glance, it might seem like an exaggeration, but I will never forget the first time I read about honor killings and public shaming, and the way a woman's life could be snuffed out for something as small as a rumor. Honestly, it gave me chills. The idea that your whole future, your whole self, could be destroyed because someone decided you had crossed a line you never even saw. It is just odd how quickly a home could turn into a courtroom and how easily a girl could become a symbol of shame. Anyway, back to the point. These tests of purity and loyalty were brutal, and they were everywhere. In some places, a woman was forced to stand in the public square and prove her innocence in front of everyone she knew. In others, she was dragged behind closed doors where the questions were asked in low voices and the answers were never good enough. And the thing is, there was never any real way to win. No matter how careful she was, no matter how obedient, there was always the chance that someone would say she had dishonored her family. And once those words were spoken, there was no going back. Some people swear that these customs were about protecting the family's name, but I can't prove that, and I don't think I want to. Because the truth is, it was about power. It was about keeping women silent and afraid and reminding them that their lives were not their own. Could be nothing, but I think that fear was the point. It was a way to keep them small, to keep them from dreaming too big or speaking too loud. I mean, think about it. How can you feel safe in a world where your own family might turn against you in a heartbeat? Where the people who are supposed to love you can become your judges and your executioners? You know what's even stranger in some stories? The women who survived these trials were praised as examples of purity and honor, as if the violence done to them was something to be proud of. Let me be real with you here. There is nothing noble about fear. I will never forget the way these stories made me feel the first time I heard them. Honestly, it gave me chills because it was so clear that a woman's body was never really hers. It was a canvas for other people's fears and ambitions, a stage where honor and shame were played out for everyone to see. Some people swear that this was the only way to keep order, but I have seen enough to wonder if that order was worth the cost. Imagine the terror of living every day with that threat hanging over your head. The way you would learn to watch every word and every gesture to make sure no one could ever question your loyalty. And even then, you would never really be safe, because once suspicion took hold, it was like a wildfire. It burned through everything you were, everything you might have been. And the worst part was that it did not even have to be true. A single word, a single glance could be enough to set it all in motion. So, what does that do to a person to live like that? To know that your life could be stolen away because of someone else's anger or someone else's pride? It is just odd how quickly the line between love and violence could blur in the name of honor. And you know what's even stranger? There were women who still found a way to hold on to themselves even in the face of that kind of fear. Quiet rebellions, hidden strength, small acts of defiance that no one could ever see but that mattered all the same. Anyway, back to the point. In this world, silence was safety and obedience was survival. Women learned to move carefully, to speak softly, to make themselves small. They learned that their worth was measured not by their hearts or their dreams, but by the way they kept themselves hidden. And even then, it was never enough. Because no matter how careful they were, there was always someone ready to question them, ready to claim that their honor had been lost. Some people swear that these customs are long gone, but I don't know if I believe it myself. because the echoes of that fear are still there in the way women learn to apologize for taking up space, in the way they are told to be quiet, to be small, to be safe. Could be nothing, but I think the past is never really gone. It lingers like a shadow in the corners of every story we tell. So, here we are again. A world that measured a woman's worth by her silence, by her suffering, by her ability to disappear. And in the middle of it all, a young girl who learned to hold her breath, who learned to walk softly, who learned that love was a dangerous thing to hope for. And here is the question that keeps me up at night. Who decided that a woman's worth was measured by silence and suffering? Who decided that the only way to be safe was to be small? Let me be real with you here. I don't have the answers, but I think it is worth asking. Because when you start to ask those questions, when you start to see how these customs were never really about love or family or faith, but about control, it changes everything. It makes you wonder what might have been possible if these women had been allowed to speak, to dream, to live without fear. Anyway, back to the point. In this ancient world, a woman's body was a battleground. Her home was her prison, and her silence was her shield. But even in the middle of that darkness, there were flickers of hope. Small, bright moments when a woman dared to believe that she was more than the world told her she could be. And I think that matters. Because in the end, it is those small, bright moments that remind us what it means to be human. In the ancient world, there was no battlefield more dangerous than the one a woman faced in childbirth. I mean, it is one of those truths that people do not always want to talk about because it is so raw and so terrifying. But let me be real with you here. Childbirth in those days was a gamble with no real safety net. A woman's life hung in the balance with every breath and every push. Could be nothing, but the stories of those days are filled with the quiet terror of mothers who knew that any birth could be their last. At first glance, it might seem like a natural part of life, but the reality was so much more than that. There were no doctors trained to help, no medicines to ease the pain, just the rough hands of midwives and the whispered prayers of women who had seen too many babies born lifeless. The walls of those small homes and dark birthing rooms echoed with the cries of women fighting to bring life into the world and sometimes failing. Some people swear that childbirth was the most sacred thing a woman could do, but I have seen enough to wonder if it was really sacred or just another way the world asked too much of her. Imagine for a moment what it must have felt like to face that fear again and again. A woman would wake in the night feeling the first pains and know in her heart that she might not live to see the morning. And still she had to go on because there was no choice, no escape from the burden of giving birth. Could be nothing but the way these stories linger in the old songs, and the half-remembered tales tells me that this fear was a shadow that never really left a woman's side. You know what's even stranger in some places? The pressure to have sons was so strong that a woman's worth was measured by the cries of the baby in her arms. If it was a boy, there was joy and relief, because a son meant hope and strength and a future. But if it was a girl, well, honestly, I do not know if I believe it myself, but some say the midwives would not even bother to wrap the baby warmly because they knew the family's disappointment would be too heavy to bear. It is just odd how quickly a newborn's first breath could decide whether the mother's pain was honored or forgotten. Anyway, back to the point. The dangers of childbirth were not just about the moment of birth itself. They were about the endless pressure to produce sons, to keep trying again and again, no matter the cost to her body or her spirit. A woman might bury one baby and then another, and still be told that she must try again. Some people swear that this was just how families survived, but let me be real with you. Here it was a cruel kind of survival that left women broken and grieving with no space to mourn. I will never forget the first time I read about how many women died in childbirth, or from the infections that came after. Honestly, it gave me chills. The numbers were staggering, but behind every number was a story, a face, a voice that was silenced far too soon. Some people say that women were strong to endure it all, and they were, but I think it is worth saying out loud that strength should never have to mean suffering alone. Imagine the heartbreak of holding a tiny silent baby in your arms and knowing that the world would move on as if nothing had happened. The mother's tears would be wiped away, and she would be told to try again because that was her duty. It is just odd how grief was expected to be quiet, and how even in her mourning she was supposed to think of others before herself. And you know what's even stranger? There were women who found ways to keep going, who found small flickers of light in the darkness, even when everything seemed lost. Anyway, back to the point. These mothers faced the terror of childbirth not once or twice, but as many times as their bodies could endure. The danger was always there in the cramped rooms, where they labored in the hands of midwives who did their best with herbs and whispered prayers, and in the cold eyes of a world that cared more about the baby than the woman who bore. Some people swear that this was the price of life, but I have seen enough to wonder if that price was far too high. Could be nothing, but I think there was something quietly heroic in the way these women faced that terror again and again. In the way they whispered to their babies, even when their own breath was fading, in the way they held on to hope, even when the world told them they should be silent. Let me be real with you here. That kind of courage is worth remembering. So, what does it take to face that kind of fear and keep going? To know that every birth could be the end and still find the strength to hope for life. Some people swear that it was just what women did, but I do not think it was ever that simple. I think it was about love and hope, and the quiet belief that even in a world that did not value their lives, they still mattered. Imagine the quiet strength of a mother who labored in the darkness and then in the quiet hours after held her baby close and sang a lullaby, even if no one else would ever hear it. The walls of those homes and the rough wooden cradles, they held so many stories of love and loss of hope and heartbreak. And in the end, it was the mothers who carried the heaviest weight of all. Anyway, back to the point. In this ancient world, childbirth was a battlefield, and every mother was a warrior. Her strength was measured not by how loud she cried out, but by how fiercely she held on to life for herself and for her baby. And even when she lost, even when the world took everything from her, she still found a way to keep going, because that was what mothers did. Some people swear that this was the natural way of things, but I have seen enough to wonder if there might have been another way, a gentler way, a way that did not demand so much suffering. So, here is the question that lingers in my mind. What kind of strength does it take to face that terror again and again, knowing the risks, knowing the pain, and still find the courage to hope? Honestly, I do not know if I have the answer, but I think it is a question worth asking. Because in the end, it is the quiet courage of those mothers that echoes through the ages, reminding us what it means to be human. In the ancient world, faith was woven into every part of life, and for women, it was both a blessing and a curse. Let me be real with you here. Religion offered comfort to some. It gave them something to hold on to in a world that was often so cold and unkind. But for many women, it was also another chain, another rule, another way to be told who they could be and what they could do. Could be nothing but the stories of those days show a pattern that is hard to ignore. Some women were revered as priestesses or oracles, their words seen as sacred, their bodies as vessels for the divine. But most women lived under the weight of rules that told them to be pure, to be quiet, to be obedient, and never question the men who claimed to speak for the gods. At first glance, it might seem like faith was a gift, a light in the darkness. And for some it was. The temples were places of beauty and wonder, the rituals a way to feel part of something greater than themselves. But when you look closer, you see how those same temples and rituals were used to keep women in their place. Some people swear that these rules were meant to protect women, but I do not know if I believe that myself. Because the truth is, the rules were written by men for men, and women were expected to bend themselves to fit. Imagine being told that your voice was too loud, that your body was too tempting, that even your thoughts could be a danger to the community. Some people might say it was all about keeping the peace, but honestly, it gave me chills to read about how many ways a woman could be blamed for simply existing. In some temples, a woman could only speak if she was behind a curtain, unseen by the men who gathered to worship. In other places, she was forbidden to enter at all, told to pray from the threshold while the men spoke for her. Anyway, back to the point. There were women who found a kind of power in these roles. Priestesses who danced and sang in the moonlight, who claimed the right to speak to the gods when no one else dared. But for every woman who found freedom in faith, there were so many others who found only chains. Could be nothing, but it seems to me that the divine feminine was both worshipped and feared, and that fear was a quiet poison that seeped into every part of life. You know what's even stranger? The stories of these priestesses and oracles are often told as if they were exceptions, as if most women did not matter at all. I will never forget the first time I read about the priestess who was said to see the future, her words shaping the fates of kings. It sounded like a story from a dream, but behind the beauty, there was always the same harsh truth. Her power was never fully her own. Even the most revered woman in the temple was expected to serve the needs of men, to speak the prophecies that would keep their power secure. Let me be real with you, here it is. Just odd how quickly faith can become a cage. A woman might find peace in the prayers and the sacred songs, but at the same time she would know that her place was set by others. Some people swear that these rituals were meant to honor the gods, but I think they were also a way to remind women that their lives were not fully their own. Could be nothing, but when you see the same patterns over and over again, it starts to feel like more than coincidence. Imagine the quiet sorrow of a girl who wanted to feel the warmth of faith, but found only rules that told her to be less. She would watch the men stand tall in the temple, their voices echoing in the halls, while she knelt in the shadows. And in that silence, she would learn the hard lesson that even the divine could be used to keep her small. It is just odd how something meant to lift the soul could be twisted into another way to keep women in their place. Anyway, back to the point. In some stories, there were women who turned that faith into something more. They found ways to slip between the lines to make their own meaning from the rituals that bound them. Some people swear that these quiet acts of defiance were the beginning of something new. Could be nothing, but I think there is something powerful in that. In the way a woman could take the words meant to bind her and turn them into songs of hope. Honestly, I do not know if I believe it myself, but some say that the gods themselves wept for the women who suffered in their names. That the divine saw the pain and the strength and the quiet courage of women who carried faith like a secret flame in their hearts. I like to think that might be true. Because in the end, faith is what we make of it, and even in a world that wanted women to be silent, there was always a spark of something more. So, here we are again. A world where faith was both a balm and a burden, where women learned to move carefully between the sacred and the profane. And in the middle of it all were the quiet prayers, whispered in the dark, the songs sung when no one else was listening. It is just odd how even in the tightest cage there can be a moment of freedom if you know where to look. Let me be real with you. Here I do not have all the answers. I do not know if faith was ever truly free, or if it was always another lock on the cage, but I think it is worth asking. Because when you see how these women carried both hope and fear in their hearts, you start to understand something deeper. You start to see that even in the harshest rules there is a thread of light that cannot be broken. Anyway, back to the point. In this ancient world, faith was supposed to be a source of comfort, a way to find meaning in the chaos. But for women, it was so often a test, a trial, a way to measure how well they could disappear behind the words of men. And yet in the quiet spaces between the prayers, there was always the question, was faith a blessing or just another lock on the cage? Behind every powerful man and every grand empire, there were women who worked and suffered in the shadows. I mean, it is one of those things people do not talk about enough because history has a way of forgetting those who were never meant to be remembered. But let me be real with you here. None of those great conquests or golden palaces could have stood without the endless labor of women whose names we will never know. Could be nothing but the stories of the ancient world are filled with the quiet work of women who cooked and cleaned and wove and healed, and no one ever thought to write their names down. At first glance, it might seem like the natural order of things. After all, someone had to keep the fires burning and the children fed while the men went off to wage wars and make laws. But the truth is, it was the women who made life possible, even when no one wanted to see it. Some people swear that this was just the way things had to be, but I do not know if I believe that myself. Because when you look closer, you see how these women carried the weight of the world on their shoulders and got none of the glory. Imagine the daily grind of a woman's life in those days. She would rise before the sun, her hands already rough from the endless tasks that waited for her. The loom would be her constant companion, the clatter of the shuttle echoing in her ears as she wove the cloth that would clothe her family. The kitchen fires would be her kingdom, a place of heat and sweat and quiet skill. She would gather herbs in the fields and turn them into healing salves and soothing teas, and through it all she would hold her family together, even when the world outside was full of chaos. Anyway, back to the point. These women worked not for praise or power, but because there was no other choice. Could be nothing, but the way their work was always invisible tells you everything you need to know about how the world saw them. Their labor was expected, their sacrifice taken for granted, and when the songs of heroes were sung, their voices were left out of the chorus. It is just odd how history remembers the kings and the generals and forgets the women who made sure the bread was baked and the wounds were cleaned. You know what's even stranger in some ways? The harder a woman worked, the more invisible she became. Her hands would be busy from dawn to dusk, but no one would think to thank her for the food on the table or the warmth of the hearth. I will never forget the first time I read about the endless labor of these women, the way they built the foundations of the world with nothing more than quiet determination. Honestly, it gave me chills because it made me wonder how many lives were built on the backs of women who never got to rest. Let me be real with you, here it is. Just odd how even the smallest tasks can add up to something enormous. A woman's day might have been filled with things that seemed simple: feeding a child, weaving a basket, sweeping a floor, but when you put it all together, it was a mountain of work that no man's glory could ever stand on its own. Some people swear that these women were content with their place, but I have seen enough to wonder if that was ever really true. Because even the quietest soul can feel the weight of being unseen. Imagine the frustration of giving everything you had and never hearing a word of thanks. The way a woman would have to swallow her own hopes and dreams because there was no room for them in a world that saw her only as a servant. Could be nothing, but I think that kind of silence can hollow out a person from the inside. And yet somehow these women kept going. They found ways to turn their work into something close to art, to find pride in the things they made, even when no one else cared to see it. Anyway, back to the point. In every grand hall and every humble cottage, there was a woman working behind the scenes, making sure that life could go on. She would mend torn clothes and soothe fevers and sing lullabies in the dark. And in those small moments, she built a world of care and connection, even if the world never noticed. Some people swear that this was just the way things were, but I do not know if I can accept that. Because I think those women deserved more than silence. Honestly, I do not know if I believe it myself. But some say that if you listen closely enough, you can still hear their voices. In the crackle of a fire, in the hush of a quiet room at night, in the warmth of a meal shared with loved ones. It is just odd how the echoes of their work still shape the world even if their names have been forgotten. Let me be real with you here. That is the kind of history that matters, because it is the history of the heart of the home, the quiet strength that held everything together. So, what would history look like if we heard these women's voices? If we told the stories of the hands that spun the thread and kneaded the bread and wiped away the tears? Some people swear it would not change much, but I think it would change everything. Because it would mean seeing the world for what it really is, a place built not just by kings and warriors, but by the patient love and labor of women who refused to give up even when the world did not see them. Imagine the world through their eyes, the quiet joys and small triumphs that no one ever thought to write down. The way a child's laughter could make all the endless work feel worth it, the way a single moment of peace could be a treasure more precious than gold. Could be nothing, but I think there is something sacred in those simple things, something that deserves to be remembered. Anyway, back to the point. In this ancient world, women's work was the backbone of everything, but their names were lost to time. And yet their legacy is everywhere, in the warmth of a home, in the comfort of a meal, in the quiet strength that still echoes in every family. Let me be real with you here, that is something worth honoring. Because it is the invisible army of women who built the world we live in, and their voices deserve to be heard. For women born into slavery in the ancient world, life was a nightmare within a nightmare. Let me be real with you. Here there is something especially cruel about how these women's bodies and souls were stolen from them from the moment they drew their first breath. They had no choice, no voice, and no hope of freedom. Could be nothing, but the way their lives were so often erased from the records tells you everything you need to know about the world that used them up and threw them away. At first glance, it might seem like slavery was the same for everyone, a brutal fate that robbed people of everything. But for women it was something even darker, because they were not only forced to labor with their hands, but with their bodies as well. Some people swear that these women were just part of the household, another pair of hands to fetch water or grind grain. But the truth is so much more horrifying. They were expected to serve in every way, to endure every demand, no matter how vile. Imagine the terror of waking each day knowing that your body did not belong to you, that at any moment you could be called to serve in ways that left scars no one could see. Could be nothing, but the stories of these women make it clear that there was no part of their lives that was safe from the greed and cruelty of the world around them. The masters claimed every part of them, their strength, their beauty, even their ability to bring life into the world. I will never forget the first time I read about how enslaved women were forced to bear children who would be born into chains just like their mothers. Honestly, it gave me chills. The idea that a woman's body could be both the tool of her own oppression and the start of another life that would know nothing but bondage. It is just odd how quickly a woman's hope could be twisted into a weapon against her. Anyway, back to the point. These women were not just workers. They were seen as property, as resources to be exploited in every possible way. Some people swear that this was just the natural order of things in those days, but I do not know if I believe that myself. Because when you look at the quiet horror of it all, you see a system built on the suffering of those who could not fight back. A system that turned women into shadows of themselves and then blamed them for their own pain. Imagine the quiet despair of a woman who knew she could never protect her own children, who knew that any child she bore would belong not to her, but to the master who claimed them. Could be nothing, but I think that kind of pain would leave a mark that never truly fades. And yet somehow these women found ways to keep going, to find moments of love and laughter even in the deepest darkness. You know what's even stranger? Some people swear that these women were nothing more than victims, but I have seen enough to wonder if that is the whole story. Because even in the worst of it, there were still sparks of resistance, small acts of defiance that said, I am still here, I am still human. Let me be real with you here that matters. Because it is in those small moments of courage that you see the strength of the human spirit. Anyway, back to the point. These women worked from dawn to dusk in fields and kitchens and workshops, but their real labor was the endless work of surviving in a world that wanted them to disappear. Some people say that they were used up and forgotten, but I think there is something more. I think that even in the shadows there is a kind of power in refusing to let go of your own humanity. Imagine the way these women would gather in the quiet moments, sharing stories and songs that reminded them of who they were. The way they would comfort each other in the night when the world outside was too cruel to bear. Could be nothing, but I think those small acts of care were a kind of rebellion, a way to claim a piece of themselves that no one else could take. Honestly, I do not know if I believe it myself, but some say that the children of these women carried those quiet lessons with them. That even in chains they learned from their mothers how to be brave, how to hold on to hope when there was no reason to hope at all. It is just odd how something as simple as a lullaby or a whispered prayer can become a thread that connects generations across time and suffering. Let me be real with you here. These stories matter, because they show us not just the horror of what was done to these women, but the strength they found to endure it. Some people swear that slavery was just the way of the world, but I think we owe it to these women to say out loud that it was wrong, that it was a theft of life and love and possibility. So, here we are again. A world that saw women's bodies as tools to be used and broken, and a world that forgot their names, even as it took everything from them. And in the middle of it all were women who somehow found a way to keep going, who found a way to love and to hope, even when the world told them it was impossible. Anyway, back to the point. These women were enslaved and exploited in every way you can imagine, and yet they were more than what was done to them. They were mothers and sisters and daughters and friends. They were the quiet strength that kept families together, even when those families were built in the shadows of cruelty. Some people swear that this is just a sad chapter of history, but I think it is more than that. It is a testament to the human spirit and a reminder of the price we pay when we forget our shared humanity. Imagine the quiet courage of a woman who knew that every part of her life was controlled by someone else, and still found a way to sing to her children, to tell them stories that would keep them strong. Could be nothing, but I think that is the kind of strength that should never be forgotten. Let me be real with you. Here it is, the kind of strength that still echoes in every act of love and resistance in the face of cruelty. So, how do you survive when every part of your body belongs to someone else? How do you keep your spirit alive when the world wants to break you? I do not have the answers, but I think it is worth asking. Because in the end, it is the quiet defiance of these women that reminds us what it means to be truly human. Even in a world that was built to silence them, there were women who refused to be broken. Let me be real with you. Here it is, one of those things that gives me chills to think about. These women were not supposed to be anything more than what the world demanded of them, but somehow they found a way to carve out their own stories. Could be nothing, but the quiet defiance of these women is a thread that runs through history if you know where to look. At first glance, it might seem like their stories were lost, buried under the weight of centuries of silence. But honestly, if you listen carefully, you can still hear them in the old songs, in the whispers of ancient legends, in the small acts of rebellion that no one ever thought to write down. Some people swear that these were just myths, but I think there is a truth in them that is more powerful than any history book. Imagine a young woman who learned to read in secret, tracing letters in the dust with a stick because she knew that knowledge was a kind of freedom no one could take away. Or the healer who used her skills to protect her sisters even when the world called her a witch. Could be nothing but those small acts of courage speak to something deep in the human heart. You know what's even stranger? The stories of warrior queens and cunning spies and wise healers are scattered across time and place, but they all share the same heartbeat: the refusal to be silent, the quiet insistence that they were more than what the world told them they could be. I will never forget the first time I read about a woman who led her people into battle, her voice strong and sure, in a world that said women should never lead. Honestly, it gave me chills because it was like hearing an echo of every woman who had ever dreamed of something more. Anyway, back to the point. These were not just grand moments of heroism either. Sometimes the most powerful acts of resistance were the smallest ones. A mother teaching her daughter to read even when it was forbidden. A girl who learned to mix herbs in the dark, who turned healing into a kind of quiet rebellion. Could be nothing but those small acts were like seeds planted in the darkness, and they mattered more than anyone could see. Imagine the weight of living in a world that wanted you to be small and silent, and still finding the strength to speak anyway. Let me be real with you. Here it takes a special kind of courage to keep going when everyone around you says you cannot. Some people swear that these women were just lucky, but I think luck had nothing to do with it. I think it was about something stronger than luck, something that lives in the marrow of every person who has ever been told to sit down and be quiet. Honestly, I do not know if I believe it myself, but some say these women changed the world in ways that no one will ever fully understand. That every quiet act of defiance, every whispered lesson passed from mother to daughter, was like a thread weaving a tapestry of resistance. It is just odd how the world can try so hard to forget them, and yet their stories keep finding a way to be heard. Anyway, back to the point. There were women who fought with swords, and there were women who fought with songs, and there were women who fought by refusing to let their dreams die. And in the end, it is all the same fight. The fight to be seen, the fight to be heard, the fight to be more than what the world says you are. Imagine a healer's hands mixing herbs in the dark, a girl's voice raised in a song no one else could hear, a queen's banner lifted high against the night sky. Could be nothing, but I think those moments matter more than any king's decree. Let me be real with you here. That is the kind of courage that still echoes today if you know how to listen. You know what's even stranger? Some people swear that these women were just outliers, that their stories were rare and unimportant. But I think that is exactly what the world wants you to believe. Because if you see them, if you hear them, you have to ask why their voices were ever silenced in the first place. And once you start asking that question, you start to see that the whole world is built on the backs of women who were never meant to be seen at all. So, what does it mean to keep fighting when the world insists you stay silent? I do not have all the answers, but I think it starts with listening, with remembering, with saying out loud that these stories matter. Because every time we tell them, every time we honor those quiet acts of defiance, we take one more step away from the darkness that tried to keep them hidden. Anyway, back to the point. These women lived in a world that wanted them to be small, but they dreamed of something bigger. They found ways to slip between the cracks, to turn their pain into power, to make their silence into a song. Some people swear that this was just the way things were, but I think it was always more than that. Because the human spirit is not so easily broken, and every act of resistance, no matter how small, is a spark that can light up the whole world. Imagine the quiet triumph of a woman who taught her daughter to dream, even when there was no reason to hope. The small victories that no one else saw, the hidden rebellions that were never written down but still mattered all the same. Could be nothing, but I think those small victories are what keep us alive in the face of a world that wants us to forget. Let me be real with you here. These stories are not just about the past. They are about now, about every person who has ever felt the weight of silence and decided to sing anyway. They are about every dream that refuses to die, even when the world says it should. And in the end, that is the kind of history that matters, the kind that reminds us what it means to be human. So, here we are again. A world that tried to silence women and the women who refused to be silent. A world that tried to make them small and the women who found ways to be so much more. And in the middle of it all, the quiet question that still lingers. What does it mean to keep fighting when the world insists you stay silent? The echoes of the past still ripple through the present. It is one of those things that you can feel even if you cannot see it directly. Let me be real with you here. There is something haunting about knowing that the same chains that bound women in the ancient world still linger in small and quiet ways today. Could be nothing, but I think we all carry pieces of those old stories within us, whether we realize it or not. The struggles those women faced, the silent battles they fought, they did not simply vanish with time. Instead, they sank into the bones of history, shaping everything that came after. At first glance, it might seem like those days are long gone, like we have moved past the idea that a woman's worth is measured in silence and suffering. But honestly, I do not know if I believe that myself. Because the truth is, the world still asks women to be small, to be quiet, to be careful. It is just odd how the chains have changed shape, but never fully disappeared. Some people swear that progress has erased the past, but I have seen enough to wonder if that is really true. Because every time a woman is told to smile instead of speak, every time she is asked to soften her voice or shrink her dreams, that old story is still there whispering beneath the surface. Imagine a girl today walking down the street, feeling the weight of every stare, every word that tells her to stay in her place. She does not have to wear a veil or bow her head to a king, but in 1,000 small ways the world still tries to tell her who she can be. Could be nothing, but it feels like the echoes of those ancient voices still shape the air around her. And yet, there is something else there too, something that feels like hope. Anyway, back to the point. Those ancient horrors, the heartbreak of being born unwanted, the terror of childbirth, the weight of forced marriages and honor killings, they have left their mark. But so too have the quiet rebellions, the small acts of courage, the voices that refuse to be silenced. You know what's even stranger? Some people swear that history is just a circle repeating the same mistakes over and over again, but I do not think that is the whole story. Because every time a woman stands up and says no, every time she chooses to speak instead of stay silent, she breaks that circle just a little bit more. Let me be real with you here. I will never forget the first time I heard the stories of women who fought back. It was like a light in the darkness, like a quiet promise that no matter how strong the chains might be, they can always be broken. Could be nothing but those stories matter. They remind us that we are not just the sum of what has been done to us. We are also what we choose to become. Imagine the strength it takes to carry those old wounds and still find the courage to laugh, to love, to build something new. It is just odd how even in the worst of it, there was always someone who refused to give up. And that refusal, that small, bright flame of defiance, it is what keeps the world moving forward, even when it feels like everything is standing still. Anyway, back to the point. The world has changed in so many ways, but the struggle is not over. Some people swear that it never will be, but I think that every act of kindness, every moment of truth, every dream that refuses to be buried is a step towards something better. Could be nothing, but I think that matters more than anything else, because it is not enough to remember the horrors of the past. We have to learn from them. We have to honor the women who lived and died and dreamed in those dark places by refusing to let their stories end in silence. You know what's even stranger? Some people say that history is a burden, something to be carried like a weight on your back. But I think it can also be a kind of map, a way to see where we have been and where we still need to go. Let me be real with you here. The echoes of those ancient voices are not just reminders of suffering. They are also reminders of strength, of hope, of the quiet power that lives in every heart that refuses to be broken. So, what does it mean to hear those echoes and keep moving forward? I do not have all the answers, but I think it starts with listening, with remembering, with choosing to see the invisible threads that connect us all. Because when you see those threads, when you honor those stories, you start to see yourself in them too. And that is where real change begins. Imagine a world where every woman's voice is heard, where every girl's laughter is seen as a gift and not a burden. Could be nothing, but I think that is the world those ancient women dreamed of in their quiet moments of hope. And maybe, just maybe, it is the world we can still build if we remember what they taught us. That even in the darkest times, there is always a light to be found. Anyway, back to the point. This is where the story ends, but it is also where it begins, because the past is never truly gone. It lives in the choices we make, in the stories we tell, in the way we choose to honor those who came before us. Some people swear that the dead are silent, but I think their voices are still here if we choose to listen. Let me be real with you. Here I do not know if we will ever fully break free from the weight of that history. But I believe we can keep moving forward step by step, voice by voice, until the echoes of those ancient screams become a chorus of hope. Could be nothing, but I think that is the kind of ending that matters. Because it is not about erasing the past or pretending it never happened. It is about taking the lessons, the strength, the quiet defiance, and using them to build something better. So, here we are, the end of the story and the start of something new. A world that still carries the shadows of the past, but also the light of every woman who refused to be silenced. A world that still has so far to go, but is moving forward one breath, one word, one dream at a time. And in the end, maybe that is enough. Maybe that is the real victory. Not the absence of struggle, but the refusal to stop trying. The quiet promise that we will keep going no matter what. And in that promise, in that simple human courage, there is a kind of ending that feels like hope.